Good evening, everyone. My name is Josh Mannon. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 13 in our book entitled Using the Success Case Method to Drive Performance and Results. My partners for this section of the presentations are Lori Rebar and Jessica Weiss. Okay, so what really is the Success Case Method? Well, it's a system that we use to evaluate training and more importantly, actually the things that surround training. But what's kind of unique about it is it does it in a really empirical and kind of scientifically based way. It provides a clear data-based business case for managers to support training. So this is really effective if you're doing a training program for the private sector, most likely, and anything that's driven by profits or is kind of driven by the bottom line, where they're going to be looking for direct financial results, things like that. It's focused on measurable and quantifiable results, so it's going to be looking for a lot of numbers. So, is there an increase in sales? Is there an increase in customer retention? A lot of these things that are just actual empirical results, things that we can actually see, they're very real. It identifies specific pinpoint factors that affect success, meaning that the success case method is really trying to narrow it down to find very specific things that actually affect whether a trainee is successful or not. So that's actually going to be not just in the training itself, but also in any of these variables that are outside of the training program. So they could be looking at the management, or they could be looking at the actual setting, or the workplace, all these different factors. And finally, it really looks at the training experience as a whole. It's not really looking at one specific part. It really kind of looks at everything. So later on, I'm going to talk a lot about how the training it's so important to not just look at the training, but then the environment outside of the training. And it's pretty interesting to see how much of the success or the failure relies on this experience outside of the training. And when we talk about success, and really when it comes to the SCM, is we're looking at training of businesses and jobs that focus on like skills-based things. So whether it's if we're dealing with salesmen and specific sales techniques, if we're looking at engineers, if they need any sort of new training on a new technology or something like that, that will allow them to produce something faster. It's something that relies on skills that can then be taught, which the trainees can then bring back to the workplace to actually boost their efficacy there. We can see that these skills that the trainees master should directly translate to increased profitability for the company. So that's really the idea behind this, is that by doing this, you're increasing that human potential in your workforce to just make them more efficient, make them more profitable, which then in turn will boost the company's success. The training success is defined as the application of training acquired capabilities leading to improved performance and job results. That's just kind of a rehashing of what we've just been saying. It's a lot of these things that the trainees should be able to take back to their actual day-to-day work and incorporate that into it to just allow them to produce more. So whether that is sales numbers, or whether that is something they actually produce while they're there, whether they're churning out reports or what have you, something like that. But there actually should be some level of quantitative result that can be measured and show an increase. So when we talk about the realities of training, especially with the SCM, we kind of have to talk about what we can expect. So, and this is a little bit shocking and unfortunate when it comes to training, but what experience has shown is that training results are reliably low quality, meaning that overall the turnout you'll get in terms of number of trainees that actually utilize the material and utilize it successfully is pretty small. Really only a small group is going to gain from the actual training, but hopefully that small group that does gain will have substantial benefits, which can actually outweigh the return on investment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when we're looking at training, we're looking at the SCM, it's really important to analyze the extremes, meaning it's important to look at the people at the bottom that just absolutely did not get anything from the training, to try to understand why they did not, and also to look at the individuals that got a ton from the training, that really became successful and learned how to utilize it effectively. So that's really where you're going to learn the most. So later when we're talking about how we actually conduct the SCM and we talk about the interviews, that's mainly who we're going to focus on, is these extremes. So those on the lower end and those on the higher end. And kind of also, we talk about the law of averages, and how so often when we talk about training and people just kind of average the overall results, looking at, oh, well, if most of the trainees really didn't get much, and you average out, the total overall gain from these few employees at the top that really embrace the training, and you kind of divide that by the total number of trainees that participated, you'll actually see pretty minimal results. But you really can't look at it that way. You kind of have to look at it much more holistically, and look at, okay, well, maybe these few are getting it, but they're making some really big changes. Maybe they're making a really big sale or something like that. That's really going to turn the tide for the company. And really the second reality is kind of back what I referenced before, but that training never works alone. Meaning that there's always going to be outside variables that are really going to be responsible for the continued success of these employees. I actually found out that potentially 80% of these failures are caused by these outside factors. Whether that's just management is just not supporting the new training. Maybe that the training came from even higher up, and middle management doesn't really know what's going on with it, so they don't really support it. They don't really support the employees in continued usage of the new skills, so it just falls to the wayside. Maybe just the environment they're in. Maybe the employees learn some sort of new technology, but then they actually don't have the computers or whatever they need there to actually follow up with these sort of skills. So there's a lot of factors that could negatively impact this training that are outside the actual training program. And we see that's actually, it's a substantially high percent. And finally, there's even other things it could have something to do with your clients, something even totally outside your control. But the SCM is really going to try to look at and identify these things, instead of just looking at the training to say, oh, well, the training looks great, so we should be great, but it failed, so we don't know why. It's actually looking at identifying and hopefully getting rid of some of these problem factors. Okay, so how do we actually do this now that we've talked about it? Generally, the SCM begins with a survey. So that's actually going to be a survey going out to anyone that participated to see how they felt the training went, and then how effective they feel the training is in their day-to-day application of their job. Now, this can be done obviously through the survey, but also if for some reason the company didn't want to go with this, and they did have some way to actually follow their employees' success or what they do on the day-to-day, so they could just pull numbers of number of reports done or sales figures, things like that, and so then they could just look at those results themselves to see if those sort of training techniques are being utilized. But generally, this survey seems to be the way to go. And finally, once that survey is done, you should have a pretty good idea of how many of the employees or how many of the trainees actually utilize the material and how many don't. So hopefully the survey will have something along the lines of, well, do you use the training material on a daily basis? And if you do, is it effective or not, and why? Something like that. So we should be able to kind of categorize these individuals. And once we kind of get a better view of that, then the interview process should really focus on those that report, yes, they do use the training material and they have had pretty extreme success, and also ones that say, no, I got nothing out of it whatsoever. So you definitely want to look at both of those things to kind of figure out what went really well and what went wrong, and how can we adjust that. So when we talk about these individuals, we can kind of lump them into different categories. They did not use the learning at all, used some learning but got no results or entirely gave up, and then kind of the little bit at the top that really got a great grasp of the new idea. Now, when we look at this, we can also talk about return on investment. And in terms of businesses, and if you're working with a business or you're working in the private sector, return on investment is really the number one thing. So no one really wants to invest in training or put that much money into it if they don't get anything out of it. So just because you say, oh, well, this has been known to really produce positive results, that's not going to be enough. You have to be able to empirically show that it does and actually see a return on that. So if they invest $10,000 in training, they need to see at least 12,000 come back or something like that. And so how do we even see that? Well, hopefully by doing these interviews and talking with these individuals, you can see these numbers and actually see these numbers increase. So especially if you're in sales, you would want to talk to the team to figure out, well, this is how much you were reporting prior to the training, and this is how much you're reporting after, and be able to do some calculations to actually look at the return on investment. And obviously, by looking at those individuals that did not do well at all, you should be able to adjust the training to hopefully get in the future maybe 5% more involved or 10% more involved. Just try to get that line there on the right scooted to the left a little more to just try to pull more employees under that used learning and got a concrete and valuable result section. Because obviously the more you have in there, the more return on your investment you'll have. And these were, I thought, some really great questions that the chapter concludes with. But it's really, what does the SCM, what does this method, this evaluation method, what questions does it answer? When training works, what value does it help achieve? So it's not just does the training work, but why are we even doing this? How is this going to help our business? It's some really realistic points, and I think that's something that the private sector is really grounded in. So I think that's a great first question to have there. How frequently and at what rate does it work well? Again, just in terms of when is this effective? How is it effective? How many employees can we expect to participate in this sort of thing? All information that's incredibly useful. When it works, why does it work? What factors help or hinder results? That might be the most important one of all the questions, just to be able to get a full understanding of the system and why it's working with certain employees or why it doesn't. And then, of course, what factors outside of the training program are helping or hindering, which again is just all going to be stuff that's incredibly useful. What is the value lost when training does not work? That kind of goes back to that return on investment. So just in terms of the financing and things like that, if we invest that much money and it doesn't work out, how much money do we lose? So that's all going to be great information when presenting something like this to a private company. What is the case for making it work better? It's kind of back on what we were talking about before. If it doesn't work, how can we make it better? If it is working already, well, how can we make it work even stronger? What would it take to make it work better? And would such efforts be worthwhile? Again, back to the return on investment. That's going to specifically require looking at the results post-training to see if it would be worth putting more effort in. And if we see that there is a decent return on investment, then by all means, it might be effective to continue with additional training, something like that. And that's going to be it for Chapter 13. Thank you all very much.